No one lasted more than 2 weeks beside Evelyn Carter. She was 36 years old, the sole heir and chief executive of Carter Dynamics, a technology empire worth tens of billions of dollars, and she had been paralyzed on one side of her body since a mysterious helicopter accident 3 years earlier. She fired anyone who dared to look at her with pity. She fired anyone who spoke to her too gently, as though she might break. The staff called her the Ice Queen behind closed doors, and the name had stopped feeling like an exaggeration a long time ago. When Jaden Brooks walked into her office for the first time, on a gray Monday morning in early spring, he did not look at the wheelchair. He looked at an old photograph sitting on the corner of her desk, and something in his face changed completely. A moment later, barely above a whisper, he said the man standing beside her father in that photograph was his own father. That single sentence would end up cracking open a secret large enough to bring down an entire empire. Evelyn Carter had built her reputation long before the accident. She had inherited controlling shares in Carter Dynamics from her father. But she had multiplied the company's value herself, expanding it from an aerospace engineering firm into one of the most powerful technology conglomerates in the country. She was known for being sharp, exacting, and impossible to fool, and even her harshest critics on the board admitted she had never once made a decision out of vanity. Then came the accident. 3 years earlier, her private helicopter had gone down during what should have been a routine flight between two company facilities. And by the time rescue teams reached the wreckage, she had already lost feeling in the right side of her body. The doctors said the damage to her spine and nerves was permanent. She said nothing at all for the first several weeks, and when she finally spoke again, something in her voice had gone cold in a way that never fully thawed. She could no longer walk without a wheelchair, and the simplest tasks now required help she despised needing. What she hated most, more than the chair itself, was the way people looked at her afterward, as though her mind had been injured along with her legs. She built walls around herself instead, thick and deliberate, and she fired every assistant who tried to climb over them with sympathy instead of competence. Caregivers came and went in a steady, humiliating parade. Some quit after a single difficult shift. Others were dismissed the moment they made the mistake of offering comfort she had not asked for. The turnover became a quiet scandal inside Carter Dynamics, whispered about in hallways but never mentioned in her presence, because nobody wanted to be the next name on that list. The executive board watched the pattern with growing alarm, because Evelyn's isolation was no longer just a personal matter. It had become a liability that could shake the entire company. Investors did not like instability at the top, and rumors of a chief executive who could not keep staff for more than a few weeks had already begun to unsettle the stock price. If Evelyn continued pushing everyone away, some board members worried she would eventually be forced to step back from daily operations altogether, and that vacancy would not stay empty for long. The most obvious person to fill it was Marcus Hale, the vice chairman, a man who had spent years cultivating an image of quiet loyalty while carefully positioning himself for exactly this kind of opportunity. Marcus visited Evelyn more often than anyone else on the board, always with flowers, always with soft words about her recovery, and always leaving with just a little more information than he had walked in with. Nobody suspected what Marcus was actually doing, because he was extremely good at appearing harmless. Behind the concerned expression and the careful phone calls to human resources about finding her better care, he was quietly rebuilding alliances among shareholders, reminding certain board members of how unstable the company might look to outsiders, and positioning himself as the reasonable, steady hand who could step in if Evelyn ever became unable to lead. It was a slow campaign, built one small conversation at a time, and it depended entirely on Evelyn continuing to isolate herself the way she always had. He kept a private ledger of names, quietly noting which directors leaned toward him and which remained loyal to Evelyn out of old friendship with her father rather than conviction, and he treated every dinner and every golf outing as another brick laid toward the same distant wall. So when human resources informed her that only one candidate remained willing to take the caregiver position after the last woman quit in tears, Marcus assumed it would end the same way it always did. The candidate's name was Jaden Brooks, and nobody in that building had any idea how wrong that assumption would turn out to be. The house Evelyn now lived in sat at the edge of the city, a modern structure of glass and steel that her father had built decades earlier, long before she had been born, back when he still believed his company would remain a family enterprise for generations to come. After the accident, the house had been quietly renovated to accommodate her condition, with ramps installed where staircases once stood, doorways widened throughout the ground floor, and an elevator added discreetly behind a wall that used to hold family photographs. Evelyn rarely looked at those walls anymore, since most of the old photographs had been packed away during the renovation and never returned to their places, as though putting them back might have felt like admitting something had changed permanently. The single silver frame on her desk was the only photograph from that earlier life she had insisted on keeping visible, though she had never told a single soul why that particular image mattered enough to survive when so many others had been quietly boxed away in storage. Jaden Brooks was 38 years old, a widower with no children, and a man whose life had taken a sharp turn nearly 4 years earlier. Before that turn, he had been an aerospace engineer, a specialist in flight control systems who had spent over a decade designing the kind of technology that kept aircraft stable when everything else went wrong. He had been good at his job, methodical and precise in a way that made colleagues trust him instantly, and he had built a quiet, steady life with his wife until an illness took her far too quickly. After she died, he found he could no longer sit at a desk designing systems meant to save lives in the abstract. He needed something closer, something with a face and a name attached to it. So he left engineering behind and retrained to work directly with people recovering from serious injury and illness. He took positions caring for high-profile patients who needed both medical support and quiet discretion, helping them through physical rehabilitation with a patience that surprised almost everyone who met him. He never explained his reasons in detail when people asked why a former aerospace engineer would choose this kind of work. But occasionally, late at night, he would tell a colleague that the job mattered to him because it helped people stand up again. In every sense of the phrase, he was calm in a way that read as strength rather than passivity. And he had an unusual gift for observation, noticing details other people walked past without a second glance. His training as an engineer had taught him to look for the small inconsistency that explained a larger failure, the loose bolt that eventually brought down an entire system, and he found he could not switch that instinct off, even when the systems in question were human rather than mechanical. Patients who had once terrified other caregivers with their bitterness found him strangely easy to be around, because he never tried to talk them out of their anger, only waited patiently for it to burn itself down to something more honest underneath. It was this exact quality that would matter more than anyone could have guessed on his very first day working for Evelyn Carter. He had taken 3 assignments before this one, each shorter than the last, and each patient he cared for had eventually improved enough to no longer need him, which he counted as a kind of quiet success, even though it meant saying goodbye each time. His placement agency had warned him, almost apologetically, that Evelyn Carter's case was different from anything he had handled before, since 4 caregivers before him had lasted a combined total of barely 6 weeks between them. Jaden had simply nodded and asked what time he was expected to start, a response that made the placement coordinator raise her eyebrows before wishing him quiet, sincere luck. When word spread through the office that a new caregiver had been hired for the chief executive, the staff did what they always did, which was place quiet bets on how long he would last. Some guessed 3 days. Others, feeling generous, guessed a week. A junior assistant in accounting bet an entire week's salary that he would not survive the first afternoon, since Evelyn had a well-earned reputation for testing new hires within the first hour. Jaden heard some of these whispers on his way to her office and simply smiled, unbothered, the same calm expression he wore through most of his days. He had been warned about her temperament during the interview process, and none of it frightened him, because he had cared for difficult patients before and understood that anger was very often just fear wearing a different mask. On that first day, Evelyn made every effort to drive him away as quickly as possible. She refused to shake his hand when he introduced himself. She would not look directly at his face, keeping her eyes fixed instead on the paperwork in front of her, as though he were an inconvenience rather than a person. When he offered to help her move from her chair to the armchair by the window for a change of position, she snapped that she did not need help from anyone, least of all a stranger who had clearly been hired out of pity. Jaden did not argue and did not flinch. He simply nodded, set down the folder of medical instructions he had been given, and began quietly organizing the paperwork on the side table, giving her the space to be angry without giving her the satisfaction of driving him out the door. It was while he was arranging a stack of documents near her desk that he noticed the photograph. It sat in a plain silver frame, slightly turned away from visitors, the kind of placement that suggested it was meant for her eyes alone rather than for display. In the image, two young engineers stood side by side in front of a large aircraft engine prototype, both of them grinning in the unguarded way people do before they understand what the future holds. One of the men was unmistakably a younger version of Evelyn's father, whose face Jaden recognized from company archives he had once studied during his own engineering career. The other man made his breath catch in his throat because it was his own father, decades younger, wearing the same crooked half-smile Jaden remembered from his childhood. He stood completely still for a long moment, the folder of paperwork forgotten in his hands, staring at a photograph he had never expected to see in this office, in this city, on his very first day. He remembered, with sudden and painful clarity, something his father had told him many years earlier, in a tone far more serious than the moment had seemed to call for at the time. His father had said that if he ever came across a photograph like this one, showing two young engineers together in front of an old prototype, he should run as far from it as possible and never ask questions about what it meant. Jaden had been a teenager then, and he had dismissed the warning as one of his father's odd, half-serious jokes. Standing in Evelyn Carter's office now, he understood it had never been a joke at all. He asked, as calmly as he could manage, whether he might look at the photograph more closely. Evelyn glanced up at him with visible surprise, because in 3 years of caregivers and assistants passing through this office, not one of them had ever shown interest in anything on her desk besides her medical charts. She studied his face for a moment, noting the sudden seriousness that had replaced his earlier composure, and something in her chest shifted slightly, though she could not yet name what it was. She allowed him to pick up the frame, watching closely as his eyes moved over every detail of the image. And when he finally looked up at her, his question landed with a weight she had not expected on an ordinary Monday morning. He asked her, quietly, why his father would have been standing beside hers in a photograph she had kept hidden from every visitor for years. Jaden did not sleep well that first night after seeing the photograph, and by the following week he had begun quietly investigating a chapter of his father's career that had always remained mysterious to him. He remembered his father speaking, only rarely and only in vague terms, about a classified aerospace initiative from many years earlier, a program that had consumed nearly 2 years of his working life before vanishing from conversation entirely. Using contacts he had kept from his own engineering days, Jaden began piecing together fragments of information about a program known internally as Project Aurora, a highly classified flight stabilization initiative that Carter Dynamics had once developed under strict secrecy. According to the little documentation that still existed, Evelyn's father had served as the lead engineer on that very project, and Jaden's father had worked directly beneath him as a senior systems specialist. What struck Jaden most was how completely the project had disappeared from official record. There were no public filings referencing Aurora after a certain date, no continuation of the technology in any later Carter Dynamics product line, and no explanation anywhere for why a program with such significant investment had simply ceased to exist. A few months after the project ended, according to old personnel records Jaden managed to track down through a former colleague, his father had died in what was officially classified as a workplace accident at a company testing facility. Jaden had been a young man at the time, too consumed by grief to question the details of an accident report that seemed complete on its surface. Now, holding new information in his hands, he realized how many years he had unknowingly accepted an answer his father himself had once warned him not to trust. He spent several evenings after his shifts sitting alone in his apartment, with a cardboard box of old family papers he had not opened in years, searching for anything that might explain the connection between the two families. He found pay stubs, old performance reviews, praising his father's precision under pressure, and a single letter of commendation signed by Evelyn's own father, thanking him for what the letter vaguely called extraordinary contributions to a matter of great sensitivity. Nowhere in the box was there any explanation of what those contributions actually were, only the polite, careful language companies used when they wanted to acknowledge something without ever naming it directly. The absence of detail felt, to Jaden, exactly as deliberate as everything else surrounding Project Aurora. Another small silence layered on top of a much larger one. The similarities between his father's death and Evelyn's own accident began to trouble him deeply the more he examined them side by side. Both had occurred under circumstances the official reports described as mechanical failure. Both involved technology connected, however distantly, to the same vanished aerospace program. And in both cases, key documentation that should have existed simply did not, as though someone had gone to considerable effort to erase the connective tissue between these two events. Jaden began to suspect that neither death nor near death had been an accident in the way the world had been told to believe. Someone, at some point, had wanted a very specific kind of silence, and they had been willing to cause real harm to secure it. Rather than confronting Evelyn immediately with theories that might sound unstable coming from a caregiver she barely trusted, Jaden chose a quieter approach. One evening, while helping her review the day's schedule, he asked simply whether she truly remembered the details of her own helicopter accident, or whether her memory of that day had always felt incomplete. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment before she answered, surprised that anyone had thought to ask her that question directly in 3 years. She told him what she remembered in fragments, the way memory often survives trauma, describing violent shaking in the cabin, a sudden and total loss of signal from the flight control systems, the pilot shouting something she could never fully recall, and then nothing at all until she woke up in a hospital bed, with half her body no longer responding to her commands. What struck Jaden immediately was one particular detail she mentioned almost as an afterthought. The fact that the helicopter's flight recorder, the device meant to preserve exactly this kind of critical data, had reportedly been destroyed beyond recovery in the crash. He knew from his years as an engineer how rare that kind of total data loss actually was, since flight recorders were built specifically to survive catastrophic damage. A recorder that had vanished so completely suggested deliberate destruction rather than accidental failure, which meant someone had wanted the truth of that flight buried along with the wreckage. From that evening forward, something between them changed in a way neither of them announced out loud. They stopped behaving like patient and caregiver, and slowly, carefully, began behaving like two people working toward the same dangerous answer. Their partnership deepened over the following weeks in ways that surprised them both. Evelyn found herself waiting for their evening conversations, moments that had nothing to do with medication schedules or physical therapy routines and everything to do with old documents, half-remembered names, and the growing shape of a conspiracy neither of them could yet fully see. She began to trust him in a way she had not trusted anyone since the accident. Not because he was gentle with her, though he was, but because he never once treated her as fragile. He argued with her when he disagreed, questioned her assumptions when the evidence pointed elsewhere, and refused to soften difficult truths simply because she was sitting in a wheelchair while he delivered them. For a woman who had spent 3 years surrounded by careful, pitying handling, that honesty felt like the first real air she had breathed in a long time. Something quieter began growing alongside the investigation. Something neither of them named directly, but both noticed in small ways. It showed in the way Evelyn's eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary when Jaden explained a new piece of evidence, in the careful attention he paid to details of her comfort that had nothing to do with his official duties, in late-night conversations that stretched far past the point where either of them had reason to still be awake. It was not loud or dramatic, nothing like the romances Evelyn had briefly known before the accident, when men had wanted the company's chief executive rather than the woman herself. This felt slower, steadier, built from trust before anything else, and precisely because of that, it felt far more real than anything she had allowed herself to want in 3 long years. One evening, while reviewing a set of scanned documents together at her kitchen table, Evelyn admitted quietly that she had stopped expecting anyone to stay long enough to matter, and that she had built her coldness deliberately, brick by brick, as protection against exactly this kind of disappointment. Jaden did not offer reassurance or promise her anything he could not guarantee, since he understood better than most how easily promises could be broken by circumstances outside anyone's control. Instead, he told her that he had learned, after losing his wife, that the people worth keeping close were the ones who stayed even after they had seen the worst version of you, not the ones who only appeared during the easy seasons. Evelyn said nothing in response, but she reached across the table and rested her working hand briefly over his. A small gesture that carried more weight than either of them tried to put into words that night. Marcus Hale noticed the change in Evelyn's behavior long before he understood its cause. And once he learned what she and her new caregiver were quietly investigating, his careful, patient campaign shifted into something far more dangerous. He began having Jaden followed discreetly, hiring people who specialized in surveillance work that left no obvious trace. He arranged for a technician with questionable ethics to gain access to Jaden's email accounts, searching for any indication of how far the investigation into Project Aurora had actually progressed. When that yielded only fragments, Marcus escalated further, arranging for Jaden's personal laptop to be stolen from his apartment during a period when he was known to be at the office. Though nothing else in the apartment was touched, a detail that made the theft look far less like ordinary burglary than it was meant to. One of Evelyn's most loyal administrative staff members, a woman named Rachel Simmons, who had quietly helped Jaden track down old personnel files from the Aurora era, disappeared from the office without warning or explanation. Her family reported her missing to local authorities, though no serious investigation followed, and Evelyn understood immediately what that silence meant. The threat was no longer hypothetical, and whoever wanted this information buried was willing to remove anyone who got close to uncovering it. Evelyn spent that night unable to sleep, replaying every conversation she had ever had with Rachel, searching for some warning sign she might have missed, some way she could have protected a woman who had only ever tried to help her. Around the same time, Marcus made his boldest move yet, proposing gently and publicly to the board that Evelyn be sent to a specialized clinic in Switzerland for an extended treatment program, framing it as an act of deep concern for her well-being. He spoke at length in the meeting about cutting-edge therapies unavailable domestically, about how much progress she might make, somewhere quiet and far from the pressures of running a global company, and several board members nodded along, genuinely moved by what sounded like generosity. What he actually wanted, and what only a handful of directors quietly understood without saying it aloud, was for Evelyn to formally step back from daily operations for an extended, indefinite period, leaving her authority conveniently vacant for exactly the kind of steady hand Marcus had spent years positioning himself to be. For the first time in 3 years, Evelyn stood in front of the full board, seated in her wheelchair with her spine straight and her voice steady, and refused the proposal in front of everyone. She said she had no intention of leaving the country, no intention of stepping back from a company her own father had built, and no intention of pretending this sudden concern for her health was anything other than what it actually was. The room went silent in a way it rarely did during board meetings, several members exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to reconsider their assumptions about Marcus Hale's motives. It was the first time in a long while that anyone in that room had seen the woman who used to run this company before the accident, had taken her voice along with her mobility, and the sight unsettled Marcus more than he was willing to admit. While tensions in the boardroom sharpened, Jaden made a quiet trip back to the house where he had grown up, a modest, single-story property in a quiet neighborhood he had kept, but rarely visited since his father's death. The house smelled of dust and old wood when he unlocked the front door, untouched furniture sitting exactly where it had for years. And for a moment, the weight of memory nearly stopped him from going any further. In the garage, behind a section of old insulation his father had once pulled back to show him a hiding place, promising even then that it might matter someday without ever explaining why. Jaden found a locked metal storage box he had almost forgotten existed. His hands shook slightly as he worked the old combination free, some part of him already sensing that whatever waited inside would change the shape of everything he thought he understood about his father's final months. Inside the box, was a worn leather journal filled with his father's cramped, careful handwriting. An external hard drive, wrapped protectively in cloth, and a set of technical schematics that matched the flight stabilization systems Jaden remembered studying during his own early engineering training. He sat on the cold garage floor for nearly an hour, reading through the journal entries, watching his father's voice on the page shift gradually from professional confidence to mounting unease, then finally to something close to fear. Near the final pages, his father had written a short, urgent note addressed to no one in particular, instructing that if Project Aurora were ever reopened or referenced again, the reader should find Evelyn Carter and trust her completely, because she was, in his own words, the only person left who deserved to know the truth. The hard drive, once Jaden managed to access its contents using equipment from his old engineering days, revealed something far more damning than either he or Evelyn had anticipated. Among the files was a recorded video, clearly filmed without the knowledge of the people in it, showing a much younger Marcus Hale in a private meeting discussing a critical flaw discovered in the Aurora flight control system during its final testing phase. In the recording, Marcus argued forcefully against reporting the flaw to regulators, citing the cost of delaying the program and the damage a public failure would do to the company's reputation, and he personally signed off on a decision to bury the defect rather than fix it. That single buried flaw, the evidence made clear, was the direct cause of both Jaden's father's death during a later systems test and, years afterward, the catastrophic failure of Evelyn's own helicopter. The night the truth fully surfaced between them marked a turning point neither Evelyn nor Jaden could ignore. Marcus, learning through his network of informants exactly what had been found in that hard drive, moved with the calculated speed of a man who understood his entire future now depended on containing the damage immediately. He bribed a member of the building's security staff to grant access to Jaden's office after hours, arranging for sensitive documents to be planted among his belongings, in a way that would make Jaden appear responsible for stealing confidential corporate files. Within hours, security discovered the planted evidence exactly as intended, and local police were summoned to the Carter Dynamics headquarters to question a man who had done nothing wrong except find the truth someone else had spent decades hiding. Evelyn refused to let the accusation stand unanswered. She insisted on speaking directly to the gathered press outside the building, a decision that stunned her own communications team, since she had avoided public appearances almost entirely since the accident. Sitting in her wheelchair in front of a wall of cameras, her voice carrying none of the coldness people had come to expect from her, she stated plainly that she believed Jaden Brooks completely, that the accusations against him were fabricated, and that the real story behind both her accident and his father's death was about to become impossible for anyone to bury any longer. The statement traveled through news outlets within hours, and public sentiment, which had never fully trusted Marcus Hale despite his careful image, began shifting hard and fast against him. In the chaos that followed, Jaden managed to slip away from the building entirely, carrying with him a final backup copy of every piece of evidence he had found, understanding that, if anything happened to him now, the truth needed to survive regardless. The largest shareholder meeting in Carter Dynamics history took place 2 weeks later, called specifically to finalize a leadership transition that Marcus Hale had spent years quietly engineering. The room was filled beyond capacity. Every major investor present in person or by video connection, all of them expecting to witness a formal vote transferring significant operational authority away from Evelyn Carter and into Marcus's steady, waiting hands. Marcus stood at the front of the room in an expensive suit, composed and confident, delivering a carefully rehearsed speech about stability, continuity, and protecting shareholder value during what he described delicately as a period of ongoing personal difficulty for the current chief executive. Several board members nodded along, already resigned to a vote they believed was little more than a formality at this point. Just moments before the vote was scheduled to begin, the doors at the back of the room opened, and Jaden Brooks walked in, calm and unhurried, carrying a laptop connected to the room's main display system. Evelyn, seated at the front with her spine straight and her chin lifted, gave a small nod, and the screen behind Marcus filled suddenly with the recorded video of his younger self dismissing a fatal design flaw, followed by internal emails confirming the decision to suppress it, followed by documentation connecting that same buried flaw directly to two separate catastrophic failures years apart. The room fell into a stunned, complete silence as the full scope of the conspiracy unfolded across the screen. Evidence spanning more than 20 years finally assembled in one place for everyone to see at once. Marcus attempted at first to dismiss the footage as fabricated, his voice rising with an edge of panic that betrayed him more than any document could have. He turned to the board, insisting the video had been manipulated, that Jaden Brooks was a disgraced former employee seeking revenge for a fictional grievance, and that the entire presentation was an elaborate act of corporate sabotage. But the evidence was too thorough, too carefully corroborated across multiple independent sources, and too clearly tied to two deaths that could no longer be dismissed as unrelated accidents once the timeline was laid out in full for everyone in the room to see. Several directors who had once counted themselves quietly among Marcus's allies now stared at him with expressions no longer resembling loyalty, their faces slowly rearranging into something closer to disgust. Federal investigators, alerted in advance by Evelyn's legal team and stationed quietly outside the building for exactly this moment, entered the room within minutes of the presentation ending. Marcus Hale was taken into custody in front of the very shareholders he had spent decades cultivating. Led out through the same doors he had once walked through with such practiced confidence, his protests growing quieter with every step. In the days that followed, several of his closest associates within the company were identified and arrested as well, each one having played some small part in either the original cover-up 2 decades earlier or the more recent effort to silence Jaden and discredit Evelyn. Investigators later confirmed that Rachel Simmons had been located alive, held under coercion in a rented property 2 counties away, and she was reunited with her family within 48 hours of Marcus's arrest, a small mercy that brought Evelyn to tears in the privacy of her own office. The shareholders in that room rose to their feet before the authorities had even finished leading Marcus away, and the applause that followed was unlike anything that room had witnessed in years. It was not applause for a strong quarterly earnings report or a favorable stock projection, the kind of recognition that usually filled that space. It was applause for the truth itself, finally standing in the open after 20 years of careful, deliberate burial, and for the 2 people who had refused to let it stay buried any longer regardless of the risk to themselves. A full year passed before either of them spoke publicly again about everything that had happened, and by then, both their lives looked different in ways neither had expected when this all began. Evelyn still used her wheelchair most of the time, since the nerve damage from the accident had never fully reversed, but she had begun an intensive physical therapy program that allowed her to stand unassisted for a few minutes at a time, something doctors had told her years earlier she should not expect to regain. More important to her than the physical progress was something harder to measure, a shift in how she woke up each morning, no longer carrying the low, constant weight of despair that had followed her since the crash. She laughed more easily now, argued more openly with her staff, and had stopped flinching at every offer of help, as though it were an insult rather than simple kindness. Carter Dynamics itself had changed as thoroughly as its chief executive. The company operated under new standards of transparency that Evelyn herself had insisted on implementing, with independent oversight boards reviewing any safety concern raised by engineers, ensuring nothing like Project Aurora could ever again be quietly buried to protect a reputation or a budget. The trial that followed Marcus Hale's arrest had taken most of the year to conclude, drawing extensive coverage as prosecutors laid out, count by count, the full extent of a cover-up that had spanned 2 decades and cost at least 2 lives directly. He was ultimately convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy and obstruction, and sentenced to a lengthy term that ensured he would spend a significant portion of his remaining years without any hand at all in the company he had once nearly stolen. A new philanthropic initiative, named the Aurora Foundation, in honor of the very project that had once caused so much harm, now funded research into mobility recovery for accident survivors and provided legal protection for engineers who came forward to report safety violations at any company. Not only her own, Evelyn had insisted on personally reviewing every grant application during the foundation's first year, wanting to understand exactly who her father's old mistake and Marcus Hale's deliberate cruelty was finally being used to help. It was, in many ways, an attempt to turn a name once associated with cover-up and tragedy into something that protected people instead of endangering them, a quiet act of repair. Neither she nor Jaden ever described publicly as anything more dramatic than simply doing the right thing. Jaden had risen to become head of innovation at Carter Dynamics, a position he had earned entirely through his own engineering expertise, rather than any connection to Evelyn personally, a distinction the board made a point of noting publicly to preserve the integrity of the appointment. He led a team focused on advanced safety systems for aviation and mobility technology, work that felt, to him, like an unbroken line running from his father's original research all the way through the tragedy that followed, and finally, into something that might prevent the same tragedy from ever happening to another family. He rarely spoke about the investigation publicly, preferring the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful over the attention that had briefly surrounded his name during the trial. On a quiet afternoon marking 1 year since the shareholder meeting that changed both their lives, Evelyn and Jaden returned together to the same office where they had first met, the space that had once held nothing but cold silence and careful cruelty on her part, testing whether he, too, would eventually give up and leave like everyone before him. The old photograph still sat exactly where it always had. The two young engineers grinning in front of their prototype, unaware of everything their friendship would eventually cost, and everything it would eventually reveal. Beside it now stood a new frame, added only recently, showing Evelyn and Jaden standing together at the ceremony, marking the official launch of the Aurora Foundation, both of them smiling in a way that had nothing performed or careful about it. Evelyn looked at the two photographs side by side for a long moment before speaking, her voice softer than the sharp, guarded tone that had once defined every word she said in this room. She told him quietly that she used to believe the wheelchair had marked the end of her life, the final closing of every door that had once been open to her, back when she could still walk into a room and never think twice about how she got there. She admitted that in the darkest months after the accident, she had genuinely believed nothing good would ever find her again. That the version of her life worth living had ended somewhere over that stretch of open sky where the helicopter went down. Jaden knelt slightly beside her chair, meeting her eyes directly the way he had from that very first day, and told her she had been wrong about that, because the chair had never been an ending at all. It had simply been the long, difficult road that finally led her to the one person who needed to find her, just as much as she needed to be found. He reminded her, gently, that he had walked into this office a year earlier, as a stranger with no expectation of staying more than a few weeks, following an unremarkable placement from an agency that had already written him off as another name for the growing list of failed hires. Neither of them, he said, could have guessed that a single photograph, sitting quietly on a corner of her desk for 3 long years, was waiting patiently for exactly the right person to finally notice it. Outside the tall windows of the office, the late afternoon light spread gold and warm across the city skyline, catching the edge of the Carter Dynamics logo mounted high above the building's entrance far below. Somewhere in that same city, the last of Marcus Hale's associates were still working through the slow, grinding process of legal consequence. And somewhere in a foundation office, 2 floors down, a new class of young engineers was beginning training funded entirely by money that had once been used to hide the very kind of failure they were now being taught to prevent. The truth, once buried for more than 20 years beneath careful lies and convenient accidents, had finally found its way into daylight. Not because a system had corrected itself on its own, but because 2 people, brought together by an old photograph neither of them had been looking for, refused to look away from what it revealed. And somewhere in that quiet refusal, in the steady patience of a man who once designed systems meant to keep people safe when everything else failed, and in the hard-won strength of a woman who had once believed her story was already over, a new beginning had quietly, stubbornly, taken root.